"You can sit here," she smiled, having no idea how deeply those simple words would change two lives. That ordinary day, Sophie only saw a well-dressed man standing awkwardly amidst the crowded, noisy café. She didn't see the silent burden he carried. She didn't notice the quiet grief hidden behind those weary eyes, nor did she know about the little boy at home, waiting desperately for a miracle. All she offered was an empty seat. But to James, that small act of kindness felt like the first genuine breath of hope he'd had in ages. "Thank you," he murmured, struggling to hide the tightness in his throat. And at that moment, neither of them had any idea just how much was about to begin. The city skyline stretched far beyond the windows of Donovan Enterprises, all glass and chrome and silence. Inside the executive office on the top floor, James Donovan stood motionless, his back to a boardroom table scattered with contracts and investor reports. His tailored suit fit perfectly, but it didn't hide the weight he carried. His eyes lingered on a framed photo, his late wife smiling, holding their son when he was just a baby. That memory felt like another lifetime. A soft knock at the door didn't pull him from his thoughts. It was his assistant's voice. "Sir, the Tokyo partners are on hold again." He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his phone and checked the time. 2:07 p.m. The nanny had messaged him hours ago. Benji had a fever. Again. He hadn't replied. What could he even say? James wasn't the type to show weakness, but being a single dad while running a multi-million-dollar company felt like walking a tightrope over fire. Since his wife's death, every day had been a test he wasn't sure he was passing. Meetings, decisions, obligations, none of it felt real when his son cried for her at night, asking why she didn't come back. He finally called the nanny, straight to voicemail. He exhaled through his nose, jaw tight. "Call me when he wakes up, please," he muttered, voice low. It wasn't authority anymore, it was desperation. His son needed him, but right now he was stuck in a tower, talking money while a child needed love. He sat down and stared blankly at the city below. The silence pressed in, louder than any chaos. His hand drifted to his pocket, pulling out a receipt, coffee-stained, slightly crumpled. It was from the café. Her handwriting was on it. "Have a good day." Sophie. A stranger, a waitress. But that moment, her smile, her voice, her warmth, it had cut through the fog. "Why can't I stop thinking about her?" he whispered. He wasn't used to this kind of feeling. Vulnerability, softness, humanity. She had offered him a seat like it was the most natural thing in the world, and for some reason it had stayed with him like a whisper in the quiet. The door opened again. "Mr. Donovan, we really need your input on the mergers." He stood. "Postpone it. Till tomorrow." "Sir?" I said postpone it. And just like that, the tycoon turned his back on billions to sit with the weight of being a father. A man, a human. And somewhere in that silence, he began to feel just how broken he really was. Tell us down in the comments, where in the world are you listening to this story from? And if you're enjoying it so far, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. There's still so much more excitement to come. The morning light filtered through a small window, casting golden rays across the worn wooden floor of a modest studio apartment. Sophie Adams sat cross-legged on a faded rug, scribbling something in a tattered notebook. Her uniform apron lay beside her, still smelling faintly of coffee and cinnamon. On the stove, water hissed in a kettle that had seen better days. Her mornings were always quiet, sacred, those few moments before the world asked too much of her again. Books were stacked in uneven towers across the room, poems she read again and again. A guitar leaned against the wall, strings worn, but still capable of singing. Sophie wasn't just a waitress, not in her heart. She dreamed of being a writer, a real one, but life had other plans, rent, bills, her mom's hospital debts. So she poured lattes and smiled for tips while hiding the ache that bloomed in her chest every time someone asked, Is this all you do?" She hummed to herself as she poured tea into a chipped mug. The steam rose and curled in front of her face. She sipped, eyes still sleepy, but mind already spinning with dialogue, ideas, scenes. Her journal was full of unfinished stories, some too close to her own life, others pure escape. But all of them held pieces of her soul, patched together like the hand-me-down sweaters she wore each winter. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Rent reminder, 2 days late, again. She pressed her lips together and shoved the phone into her coat pocket. No use panicking. Not now. She still had a shift to survive. As she laced her sneakers, she whispered to herself the same line every morning, one her grandma used to say when things got tough. Kindness is a seed. One day, it'll grow back to you. Outside, the city was just waking up, but Sophie was already running late. Her hair was tied up in a loose ponytail, and she tugged on her faded green scarf as she jogged to the bus stop. The wind bit at her cheeks, but she didn't mind. At least she was moving. She believed movement meant hope. If she kept going, something would eventually change. On the crowded bus, she clutched the metal pole, swaying with every turn. A little girl with pigtails smiled up at her, and Sophie smiled back. That was her gift. No matter how tired, she always had a smile. Not out of obligation, but because she understood what it meant to need one. As she approached the café, her eyes caught sight of the same homeless man she always passed. She paused, handed him her bagel and walked away without waiting for thanks. It wasn't about grand gestures. Sophie lived by small ones. The world, she believed, could be softened by little acts of love. And in just a few hours, one of those acts, one simple invitation, would begin a story she never saw coming. The bell above the cafe door chimed for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Sophie barely looked up. The lunch rush had hit early, and her section was already a storm of half-filled coffee mugs, cold toast returns, and impatient glances at the clock. She moved from table to table with practiced grace, balancing trays and fake smiles. But her feet ached, her back throbbed, and the sting behind her eyes threatened to spill over. "Hey, sweetheart," barked a man in a suit, snapping his fingers. This was supposed to be decaf. "I'm so sorry," Sophie said gently, reaching for the mug. "You're lucky you're cute," he added with a smirk. She swallowed the insult with a tight smile. She was used to being overlooked, used to kindness being mistaken for weakness. But some days, it was harder than others. Meanwhile, across the city, James sat in a boardroom surrounded by polished egos and buzzing phones. Mark Jennings, his executive VP, was pitching aggressively, charts, numbers, big promises. But James couldn't focus. The image of Benji curled in his bed last night, cheeks flushed, calling for his mom in a fevered haze, haunted him. James had sat beside him, helpless. All he could do was hold his hand and pretend everything would be okay. "We could triple projections by Q3, Mark boasted, gesturing toward a slide full of red arrows and zeros. James cut in, voice flat. "At what cost?" The room stilled. "Excuse me, you're talking about expansion like it's a game, but I don't gamble with people's lives." His voice was quiet, but final. Back at the cafe, Sophie slipped into the back room, leaning against a shelf of paper cups. She rubbed her temples and let herself breathe. Her co-worker Lana passed by, rolling her eyes. "You always take the weirdos and creeps with a smile. Don't you ever get tired of pretending?" "I'm not pretending," Sophie whispered. But maybe she was, for her own survival. Later that night, after her shift, she walked home alone, the wind tugging at her coat. Her mind wandered, back to the man from the other day, the one she let sit across from her during her break. His eyes had been tired but kind, sad but searching. She wondered if he was okay. It was a silly thought. Just a moment. Nothing more. Right? At the Donovan estate, James stood by Benji's door, listening to his son's quiet breathing. He hadn't opened his laptop in hours. The deal with Mark could wait. The world could wait. He was tired of rushing towards success while missing the small, sacred things, like the peace on a sleeping child's face. And across the city, under a thin blanket, Sophie picked up her guitar. Her fingers found the strings automatically, and a soft melody filled the room. Her voice cracked as she sang a lullaby her mother used to hum. In that fragile moment, she imagined someone listening, someone who needed it, someone who might just remember her face. Little did she know, someone already had. The call came just after Sophie had finished wiping down the counter. Her shift had ended 20 minutes ago, but she always stayed a little longer. It was part habit, part hope. She liked the quiet after the chaos, the way the cafe exhaled when everyone else had gone. Her phone buzzed on the pastry case. Unknown number. "Hello? Miss Adams?" The voice was polite, professional. "You've been selected for a private interview at Donovan Enterprises. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." She blinked. "There must be a mistake. I didn't apply for anything there." "It's no mistake. We hope to see you." Click. Sophie stared at her phone like it had grown horns. Donovan Enterprises? That was billionaire territory. A place of polished shoes and power suits, not of waitresses with student debt and worn sneakers. Still, something about the tone, the certainty, made her heart race. She didn't sleep that night. Her mind kept returning to one moment, the stranger in the cafe. The next morning she stood in front of a skyscraper so tall it made her dizzy. She had borrowed a clean blazer from Lana and wore her nicest jeans. The lobby sparkled like something out of a dream, all marble and chrome, and people who walked like they owned time. She clutched her purse tightly and gave her name at the front desk. "Mr. Donovan will see you now," the receptionist said. Her breath caught. "Mr. Donovan? As in, the owner? Not HR? Not some assistant?" She stepped into the elevator, heart pounding, the floors ticking by like seconds. When the doors opened, he was there, James, the man from the cafe. But this time, he wore a perfectly tailored suit and stood behind a desk of glass and steel. "You," she whispered, stunned. He gave her a small smile. "I was hoping you'd come." Sophie sat across from him, unsure whether to laugh or run. "What is this?" He folded his hands. "My son Benji needs someone. Not just a nanny, someone who sees people the way you do." Before she could respond, the door burst open. A little boy with tousled brown hair ran inside, straight into James's arms. "Daddy!" he cried. James picked him up and smiled gently. "Benji, meet Sophie." Benji peered at her with big, curious eyes. Then, without hesitation, he ran to her and hugged her leg like he'd known her forever. Sophie froze, then knelt to his level. "Hi," she whispered. "You smell like cookies," he said. She laughed through the lump in her throat, and in that moment the noise of the city faded. There was just her, this boy, and the man who had remembered a single act of kindness and turned it into a new beginning. The Donovan mansion was unlike anything Sophie had ever seen. High ceilings, marble floors, velvet drapes that whispered wealth. But what struck her wasn't the luxury. It was the silence. An eerie, polished stillness that felt too big for just two people. That first day, Benji grabbed her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world and dragged her to the playroom. "Want to see my dinosaurs?" By the end of the week, the mansion echoed with laughter. Benji's, mostly, then Sophie's, sometimes even James's, in short surprised bursts he hadn't made in years. Sophie didn't try to impress anyone, she just listened. She learned how Benji liked his sandwiches cut, what books made him sleepy, and how he always held his mother's scarf when he was scared. She never touched it, just sat with him while he held it close. James watched quietly from the sidelines. He didn't know how to explain it, but Sophie brought light into rooms he had long abandoned. She didn't try to fill his wife's absence, she honored it. And somehow, That made the space feel less like a wound. Late one evening, as Sophie tucked Benji in, James stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You didn't have to sing," he said. She turned. He asked. James nodded slowly. "He hasn't asked anyone to stay in a long time." They ended up sitting on the kitchen floor that night, sharing leftover cupcakes and stories. James told her about his wife, about losing her too quickly, too unfairly. Sophie told him about her mom, about waiting in hospital corridors with poems tucked in her back pocket. The more they spoke, the more the space between them shrank. "People say grief gets easier," Sophie whispered, "but I think it just changes shape." James looked at her, truly looked. "You make it bearable." The following days blurred into something unexpected, comfortable. James began working from home more often, not just to check on Benji, but to feel the hum of life returning to his home. One afternoon he passed Sophie and Benji in the garden, laughing while planting tomatoes. She had dirt on her cheek, a wide smile, and James felt something ache inside his chest, something warm, something dangerous. That night, Benji climbed into bed with both of them after a bad dream. Sophie didn't flinch. She just scooted over and let the boy snuggle between them. James watched her in the low light, her eyes already drifting shut, and in the quiet of that moment, he realized something terrifying and beautiful at once. He wasn't falling for her. He already had. For a while, everything felt too good to be true. The Donovan mansion had softened. Mornings began with pancakes and cartoons. Nights ended with shared stories, soft laughter, and the warmth of something new, blooming quietly between Sophie and James. But peace, as always, was fragile. Mark Jennings, James's ambitious executive VP, watched the changes with growing resentment. He had built his entire career on control, on keeping the CEO detached, sharp, untouchable. And now he was watching that same CEO trade meetings for bedtime stories. To Mark, Sophie was a threat, a distraction, and worse, an outsider. It started with whispers. "The nanny's getting too close. He brings her to private events now." She was just a waitress, wasn't she? Mark let the rumors fester, feeding them to the right people with surgical precision. Then he planted the final seed, subtly, over a glass of whiskey during a board dinner. "What if she's not as sweet as she seems? Gold diggers rarely come with warnings." James didn't believe it. Not at first. But he noticed Sophie growing quieter, more hesitant. The sparkle she carried with her into every room had dimmed. She avoided his eyes. She declined an invite to a fundraiser. "I don't belong in those circles," she said with a sad smile. Then came the board meeting. Mark stood, voice cold. "I think it's time we discuss professional boundaries. Personal choices that could reflect poorly on the company." James's fists clenched. "You're crossing a line." Mark smirked. "Am I? Or is she?" Sophie was waiting for him outside that day. Her hands trembled as she held a folded piece of paper, her resignation letter. "I never meant to complicate things," she said softly. "This isn't my world. And Benji, he deserves better than gossip and whispers." James felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Sophie, don't do this." "I already did," she said. Her voice cracked. "You have a company to protect, and I have a heart I need to keep whole." She kissed Benji's forehead while he slept and left before sunrise. The scarf he once held to remember his mother now lay forgotten. In its place was a silence far deeper than before, and James, powerful, brilliant, respected, stood alone in the same kitchen where he once laughed with her, staring at the empty space she used to fill. But this time, he had no idea how to fix it. The cafe door jingled softly as Sophie stepped inside, her old apron tucked under her arm like a piece of a life she never fully left. The place hadn't changed. Same chipped mugs, same burnt coffee smell, same corner booth where she used to write between shifts. But Sophie, she wasn't the same. Something had cracked inside her, and no amount of pretending could hide it. Customers smiled, unaware of the storm behind her tired eyes. She poured coffee, cleared tables, refilled sugar jars. Every movement felt like a rewind, a step backward into a version of herself she had hoped to outgrow. At night, she stared at the ceiling, haunted by Benji's laugh, the way he hugged her leg, the softness in James's eyes the last time he said her name. Meanwhile, the Donovan mansion felt colder than ever. Benji stopped laughing. He barely ate. He refused bedtime stories and cried for hours without explaining why. James tried everything, new toys, favorite meals, even sleeping in the same room. Nothing worked. One night, Benji whispered, "Where's Sophie?" And James realized he had broken more than just his own heart. At the office, James buried himself in work. Meetings stacked back to back, numbers, deadlines, projections. But the boardroom felt hollow. Mark gloated quietly, but James didn't care. His empire felt pointless without the light Sophie brought. Without her, the house was just stone. His son, just a mirror of his own emptiness. He sat in the playroom one evening, holding the scarf his wife left behind. For the first time in months, he cried, not just for his late wife, but for the family he lost a second time, this time by choice. "I pushed her away," he murmured, "and I let them both down." Sophie was sweeping crumbs off a table when she saw it, a drawing tucked under the sugar caddy. Crayon lines, 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one small, and one with long red hair. Above them, in crooked letters, "Us." Her chest tightened. It was Benji's drawing, left for her or maybe forgotten. She stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them, didn't hide. For once, she let herself feel it all, the ache, the guilt, the love. Because loving them had changed her, and leaving had broken her open in ways she never expected. That night, James made a decision. No more running, no more pride, no more fear. He would find her, apologize. Fight for her, for his son, for the family that had formed not through blood or vows, but through kindness, healing, and a seat offered at the right moment. He didn't know what he'd say, but he knew this. He couldn't live one more day pretending she wasn't everything. The sky was heavy with grey clouds as Sophie wiped down the front counter, her reflection faint in the cafe window. Rain tapped lightly against the glass, matching the rhythm of her thoughts. Life had settled back into its quiet rhythm, but her heart hadn't. Every laugh from a child, every father who hugged his kid too tight, every soft goodbye, all of it scraped against a bruise she tried to ignore. And then, the door opened. She didn't look up at first, just another customer, she figured, but then she felt it, that stillness, the kind that follows someone who's lost sleep, dignity, and maybe something more. Her eyes lifted. James Donovan stood there, soaked from the rain, suit rumpled, no tie. He looked nothing like the composed CEO she once knew, and everything like the man who'd held her gaze that first day across a crowded cafe. "Sophie," he said, voice raw. She blinked. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you, to say what I should have said before." The cafe fell silent around them. He stepped closer, each word careful, each breath full of weight. "I was scared of the past, of losing control, of losing you, and in the process I lost us." Her hands trembled slightly. "James, Benji cries for you. I tried to read him stories, but he only listens when I say your name. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself." Tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to run. She wanted to believe. "You didn't come for work," she whispered. "No," he said. "I came to ask you for something much harder than a job." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside, a drawing, Benji's again, but this time a house with 3 people inside. "He wants this to be real, so do I. I'm not asking you to come back as a nanny. I'm asking you to come home, as his mother, and maybe as the woman I want beside me for the rest of my life." The world spun. Sophie held the paper like it might disappear. She looked at him, so undone, so human. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to decide now," James replied, voice trembling. "Just don't walk away without knowing we're ready. For you. For this." And in the hush between their breaths, the café filled with something unspoken. Possibility. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed that night, the drawing still in her hands. Her fingers traced the crayon outlines over and over as if they might reveal the answer she couldn't name. She had dreamed of being wanted, really wanted, for who she was, not just for what she could do. But now that it was happening, fear crept in like a shadow. By morning, she had made up her mind. She needed to speak to James. In person, on her terms, no walls, no pressure, just truth. She arrived at the Donovan building before noon. The receptionist blinked in surprise, but let her pass. As the elevator rose, so did her heart rate. This wasn't about fairy tales. This was real life, complicated, messy, and hers. But she wasn't ready for what waited when the doors opened. Mark was there, smug, leaning against James's desk like he owned it. A reporter stood beside him, microphone clipped and camera ready. "This is the nanny," Mark said loudly. The one who suddenly became more than a nanny. Sophie froze, eyes flashing. "What is this?" "Public image cleanup," Mark replied smoothly. "The board has concerns, so we're making the narrative cleaner." James entered from a side door. The moment he saw Sophie, his entire body went rigid. "What the hell is going on?" Mark smiled. "Damage control, before the public starts asking questions about who's sleeping in the CEO's house." Sophie's cheeks burned, but her voice stayed calm. "You think love is something to manage? To contain?" Mark scoffed. "I think optics matter." James stepped forward, jaw tight. "Get out." Mark blinked. "Excuse me." "I said get out. You've crossed the last line." The reporter hesitated, sensing the storm shifting. Mark paled but turned and walked out. The camera stopped rolling. James looked at Sophie, breath heavy. "I'm so sorry." But she shook her head, then turned to the camera. "Let it run," she said. "You want a statement? I'll give you one." The reporter nodded slowly. "I'm not a nanny who seduced her boss. I'm a woman who showed up every day with an open heart, who saw a boy hurting and a man pretending not to. I didn't fall into this story. I chose it. I chose them, and they chose me." She turned to James. "You once said you didn't gamble with people's lives, but love is always a risk, and I'm not afraid to take it anymore." James crossed the space between them, took her hand, and said loud enough for the world to hear, "Then let's take it together." And the room, once ruled by power and strategy, finally witnessed something stronger. Truth. 3 months later, the Donovan mansion was no longer just a monument to wealth. It was a home. Curtains fluttered from open windows, the scent of cinnamon rolls drifted through the halls, and toys, real, used, loved toys, lined the staircase. Laughter echoed. Tiny footsteps pounded across the hardwood. Benji was thriving. James no longer lived in constant tension. He woke up early, made pancakes badly, and learned how to tie tiny shoelaces one loop at a time. At work, he was sharper than ever, but no longer cold. He spoke less about mergers and more about people. The board, once skeptical, began to notice the shift in him. A man who had lost everything had somehow gained it all back, because he stopped hiding behind success and chose connection instead. Sophie, now partner in every way, brought her own rhythm into the house. She hadn't stopped working, not really. Only now her words poured onto pages that James printed out and read at night. She was writing again, and for the first time she believed her voice mattered. Her old journals lay in a box in the closet, replaced by a laptop and a stack of drafts, stories drawn from healing, from grief, from second chances. Every Friday they had family pizza night in the backyard. Benji picked the toppings, and James burned half the crusts. Sophie didn't care. They danced barefoot on the patio, spilled lemonade, sang old songs out of tune. The moments were messy and imperfect, and somehow more precious than any diamond James had ever signed for. One afternoon, Sophie found James reading her newest story in the garden. He looked up, eyes wet. "You should publish this." She sat beside him. "It's just for us." He took her hand. "Then it deserves the world." Benji, now confident and endlessly curious, no longer clung to his mother's scarf. Instead, he held Sophie's hand at night. "Can you stay forever?" he asked once, sleep-heavy. She kissed his forehead. "As long as you want me to." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, James pulled Sophie close. "I thought I was too broken to feel whole again," he murmured. "You weren't broken," she whispered back. "You were waiting. We all were." And in that warm light, in a house once filled with silence, they found peace. Not in perfection, but in the choice to love despite fear. Because love didn't come to fix what was wrong. It came to remind them what had always been right. A soft breeze swept through the city as Sophie pushed open the familiar café door. A tiny bell jingled, echoing through the air like an old friend calling her home. The place looked exactly as she remembered. Small tables crowded close together, the same faded menu board, the scent of burnt espresso and fresh pastries in the air. But this time, she wasn't alone. Benji ran ahead, pressing his nose against the glass display case. "Can I get the chocolate one?" James chuckled beside her. "Only if I get a bite." Sophie smiled at both of them, her heart full, her hands steady. This was no longer the scene of something beginning, but the place where everything had begun. They sat at a corner table. That table. The same one where Sophie had once said, "You can sit here," without knowing she was opening a door to her future. James looked around, eyes misting. "I haven't been back since that day," he murmured. Sophie touched his hand gently. "Me neither." A moment later, the door swung open and a man stepped in, drenched in sweat, messy tie, lost expression. He scanned the cafe like he didn't belong. The only empty chair was at the table next to theirs. He hesitated, unsure if he should stay or leave. Without thinking, Sophie leaned over, smiled, and said with the same warmth from a lifetime ago, "You can sit here." The man blinked, startled. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," she said. "Sometimes that's how everything begins." James smiled at her from across the table. Benji waved at the stranger like they'd known each other forever, and in that simple moment, the circle closed. An act of kindness repeated, a new story ready to begin, because some miracles start with a smile, and others, como lugar vazio e gesto que muda destinos. Comment down below if you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to subscribe for more like this. See you in the next video.